It began with a name, Indonesia, spoken from the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, already facing global condemnation for his military campaign in Gaza, turned heads when he referenced Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto's speech. "I took note of the encouraging words spoken here by the President of Indonesia," Netanyahu said, his voice steady, calculated. "This is the country with the largest Muslim population of all nations. It's also a sign of what could come." The chamber, already half empty from a mass walkout, fell into a tense silence. Outside, the words ignited something far more volatile. Within hours, the streets of Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem swelled with protesters. Not a few hundred, not even thousands, but over 600,000 Israelis, an unprecedented wave of dissent, marched, chanted, and clashed with police. Their fear wasn't abstract. It was rooted in the possibility that Netanyahu's speech had signaled a dangerous pivot, a normalization effort with Muslim-majority nations that could come at the cost of Palestinian justice, or worse, provoke retaliatory violence. Some carried signs reading, "Not in our name." Others burned effigies of Netanyahu outside his official residence. The air was thick with tear gas and fury. Inside Israel's Knesset, opposition leaders demanded an emergency session. "He's playing with fire," one member shouted. Mentioning Indonesia, without consultation, without context, it's reckless. Meanwhile, Indonesian officials scrambled to clarify their stance. Foreign Minister Sugiono reiterated that any dialogue must begin with recognition of Palestinian sovereignty. But the damage was done. Netanyahu's words had been weaponized, not just abroad, but at home. And for many Israelis, the fear wasn't just about conflict. It was about being dragged into a geopolitical game they no longer believed in. The protests weren't just about Netanyahu's mention of Indonesia. They were about a growing fracture in Israeli society between those who support his hardline policies and those who fear they're steering the country toward isolation and perpetual war. For many Israelis, the reference to Indonesia wasn't a diplomatic gesture. It felt like a provocation, a gamble with regional stability. Indonesia has long been a vocal supporter of Palestinian rights, and while it has no formal ties with Israel, its influence in the Muslim world is undeniable. Netanyahu's words, interpreted by some as an overture, by others as a challenge, struck a nerve. In Jakarta, the reaction was swift but measured. Indonesian media dissected the speech, analysts debated its implications, and social media lit up with calls to remain firm on Palestine. "We will not be baited," one prominent commentator posted. "Recognition must come with justice." Yet behind closed doors, Indonesian diplomats were reportedly caught off guard. There had been no prior indication that Israel would mention Indonesia, let alone frame it as a potential partner. The timing, amid escalating violence in Gaza, made the gesture feel tone-deaf at best, manipulative at worst. Back in Israel, the protests grew louder. Artists, academics, and even former military officials joined the chorus of dissent. "This isn't about peace," said retired General Amos Gilad. "It's about optics. And it's dangerous." The Israeli press began to question the strategy behind Netanyahu's speech. Was it a distraction from domestic scandals? A bid to shift global focus? Or a genuine attempt to open new diplomatic channels? Whatever the motive, the fallout was real. And for the hundreds of thousands marching in the streets, the message was clear. They didn't want their future dictated by unilateral gestures and ambiguous alliances. As the protests intensified, the Israeli government scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Netanyahu's office released a statement claiming the mention of Indonesia was a gesture of diplomatic optimism, not a policy shift. But the damage was already rippling through layers of Israeli society. Young Israelis, many of whom had grown up under the shadow of endless conflict, saw the speech as another example of leadership disconnected from reality. "We're tired of being pawns," said Yoel, a 23-year-old student marching in Tel Aviv. He speaks of peace while bombs fall in Gaza. He invokes Indonesia while ignoring the cries of our own people. The contrast was stark. Inside the UN, Netanyahu's speech was polished, rehearsed, and aimed at international ears. Outside, the streets of Israel were raw, chaotic, and deeply personal. Families marched together, some holding photos of loved ones lost in past wars. Others carried placards demanding accountability, transparency, and a new direction. The protests weren't just political, they were generational. A younger, more globally aware population was pushing back against the old guard, demanding a future that didn't hinge on perpetual conflict or diplomatic theater. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, the public response was growing more vocal. Religious leaders, civil society groups, and student unions issued statements reaffirming their support for Palestine. "We will not be used as a political tool," declared one prominent cleric. The Indonesian government, while cautious, emphasized that any engagement with Israel must be rooted in justice and mutual respect. The mention of Indonesia had opened a door, but it was one that neither side seemed ready to walk through. And as tensions mounted, the question loomed: was this a diplomatic misstep, or the beginning of a new, unpredictable chapter in Middle Eastern politics? The international response was mixed. Western media outlets highlighted Netanyahu's mention of Indonesia as a bold diplomatic gesture, while others questioned the timing and intent. In Washington, officials remained tight-lipped, though some analysts speculated it was part of a broader strategy to isolate Iran by courting moderate Muslim nations. But in Israel, the narrative was unraveling. The protests had grown into a movement, one that no longer centered solely on Netanyahu's speech, but on the deeper discontent simmering beneath the surface. Economic strain, rising living costs, and a sense of moral fatigue were converging into a single, unified cry: change. At the heart of the unrest was a generational divide. Older Israelis, shaped by decades of conflict and survival, viewed Netanyahu's tactics as necessary, even patriotic. But younger citizens, exposed to global perspectives and digital activism, saw them as outdated and dangerous. "We're not afraid of peace," said Avi, a 19-year-old conscript. "We're afraid of being lied to. We're afraid of being used." His words echoed across social media, amplified by influencers, journalists, and diaspora voices who saw the protests as a turning point. In Indonesia, the ripple effects were felt too. Student groups organized solidarity rallies, not in support of Israel, but in defense of Palestine and against being co-opted into a narrative they hadn't agreed to. The mention of Indonesia had inadvertently galvanized both sides, those seeking genuine diplomacy and those resisting manipulation. Netanyahu's speech, intended to project strength and vision, had instead exposed vulnerability and division. And as the protests entered their second week, the question wasn't whether the unrest would end, it was whether the government would listen. Because for the first time in years, Israelis weren't just reacting to conflict. They were demanding a new story, one they could believe in. In the days that followed, the Israeli government faced mounting pressure, not just from protesters, but from within its own ranks. Several coalition members broke silence, questioning the wisdom of invoking Indonesia without prior diplomatic groundwork. "We are not in a position to gamble with words," one minister said. "Every sentence spoken on the world stage carries weight." Netanyahu, however, remained defiant. In a follow-up interview, he doubled down, suggesting that dialogue with Muslim-majority nations was essential for long-term peace. But critics weren't convinced. They saw it as political theater, a distraction from domestic unrest and international scrutiny. The protests, now entering their third week, had evolved into organized civil resistance. Sit-ins, teach-ins, and nightly vigils became common across major cities. The Israeli flag flew alongside banners calling for reform, accountability, and a new diplomatic ethos. "We want peace," said Miriam, a mother of two attending a candlelight vigil in Jerusalem. But not at the cost of truth. Not through manipulation. Her words reflected a growing sentiment that peace must be earned, not staged. In Indonesia, the government maintained its stance. President Prabowo clarified that while Indonesia supports global dialogue, it will not compromise on its principles. Palestinian sovereignty is non-negotiable, he stated. The mention of Indonesia had sparked a global conversation, but it also revealed the fragility of trust in international diplomacy. For Israelis, it was a wake-up call. For Indonesians, a reminder of their role in shaping regional conscience. And as the world watched, one truth became clear. Words spoken at podiums can stir nations, but it's the voices in the streets that shape history. Netanyahu's speech may have opened a door, but it was the people, not the politicians, who decided whether to walk through it.